Coming later, right? Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Subcommittee on Energy markup of 4 bills addressing the development, deployment, competitiveness, and regulation of nuclear energy technologies. You know, throughout this Congress, we've repeatedly heard about the immense challenges facing all parts of our nation's nuclear industry. And while individual states have taken steps to preserve specific nuclear power plants, the underlying intellectual and industrial nuclear infrastructure is at risk of further atrophy in the absence of a coherent and defined policy from the federal government. The bills today take some important steps to establish that policy. At a hearing on these 4 bills last month, the Department of Energy's Office of Nuclear Energy, the National Nuclear Security Administration, and industry leaders discussed the urgent need to take action now due to the time-consuming and complex requirements associated with licensing and developing nuclear facilities. So the bills before us address that need. They've been developed in coordination with feedback from members of this committee, Department of Energy, NRC, and a broad range of stakeholders. I look forward to continuing bipartisan collaboration to advance these 4 proposals. The first proposal that we're going to consider this morning is the committee print titled Advancing U.S. Civil Nuclear Competitiveness and Jobs Act, offered by Congressman Johnson. This bill will assist our U.S. nuclear industry's ability to compete successfully in an increasingly competitive global market. The proposal provides a more predictable and efficient authorization process for the review and approval of low proliferation risk technologies, and such steps will help level the playing field for American companies in international competition of nuclear energy. The next bill, H.R. 1320, the Nuclear Utilization of Keynote Energy, or Nuke Act, is a bipartisan bill sponsored by Representative Kinzinger and Doyle to make targeted reforms to the NRC's fee structure and streamline certain licensing and regulatory actions. This bill will increase transparency, predictability, and efficiency in the regulatory process, which for sure will benefit our constituents who fund the NRC through user fees embedded in the cost of nuclear-generated electricity. The more efficient, streamlined decision-making process established by this legislation will lay the groundwork for more predictable timing for our current and future nuclear infrastructure. The Advanced Nuclear Fuel Availability Act, H.R. 6140, is a bipartisan bill introduced by Representatives Flores and McNerney to direct the Secretary of Energy to establish a program to make high-assay, low-enriched uranium available for use in the first-of-a-kind advanced nuclear reactor design. This fuel will enable the development and deployment of a new generation of innovative nuclear technologies in the U.S. And lastly, H.R. 6141, a bipartisan bill, again sponsored by Representatives Hudson, Peters, Wilson, and Norcross, directs the Secretary of Energy, in collaboration with the NRC, Department of Defense, and GSA, to identify key components of a pilot program to site, construct, and operate very small nuclear reactors known as micro-reactors to provide energy resilience for mission-critical national security functions. Such a pilot program could capture some of the unique and revolutionary characteristics of tomorrow's nuclear reactor designs and provide additional benefits for revitalizing the U.S. nuclear industry. More work remains to be done to reassert the global leadership of American nuclear know-how for the next generation, but this legislation before us today is a good and essential step towards a multifaceted strategy. I yield for an opening statement to the ranking member of the subcommittee, my friend Mr. Rush from Chicago.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, before I get into the suite of nuclear bills that is before us today, I just want to reiterate my position that I touched on in yesterday's hearing. As I mentioned, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Pallone and I, along with all 24 Democratic members of the full committee, sent a letter to Chairman Walton and Health Subcommittee Chairman Burgess on yesterday, requesting an immediate hearing on the Trump administration's misguided policy of separating immigrant children from their parents at our southern border. While the president, Mr. Chairman, may have suddenly shifted his stance and signed an executive order undoing this abominable policy for the time being. Who knows when he might change his mind on a whim and reverse himself once again. Mr. Chairman, it is critical that we hear from key administration officials on how this loathsome policy came about. More importantly, as elected representatives, we need answers on how many of these children were ripped from their parents, where are all these children now, and what is the administration procedure for ensuring that all of these babies will indeed be reunited with their parents. This is an important issue that is of the utmost concern to many, if not all, Americans, regardless of their political leanings or religious affiliations. So I hope that we can schedule this hearing sooner rather than later. With that being said, Mr. Chairman, as I stated in the hearing on these 4 nuclear bills, it is my desire that we work with the majority side to attempt to find consensus so that these bills are forwarded out of full committee with bipartisan support. And Mr. Chairman, the most problematic of these 4 bills rather, for me is the Advancing U.S. Civil Nuclear Competitiveness and Jobs Act. This bill will, among other things, revise DOE's review of the Part 810 process by expediting procedures for transferring civilian nuclear technology, including to foreign powers. I can tell you, Mr. Chairman, that I have even less confidence in the Trump administration today than I had a few weeks ago when we held a hearing on this bill, so I do not see the wisdom in moving this bill forward at this time. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair would recognize for an opening statement, gentleman, the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Walden.
I thank the gentleman from Michigan for his leadership and for acknowledging me on these energy issues. Good job to the committee. This morning, we're going to continue to advance our legislative efforts to modernize the Department of Energy to better reflect the department's current national and energy security missions. Now, throughout this Congress, as you all know, we've sought specific DOE authorities to update in light of an ever-changing energy landscape and evolving national security threats. Today's subcommittee markup continues these efforts, also includes modernizing nuclear policies that Congress originally embedded in DOE's predecessor agency, the Atomic Energy Commission. When the Atomic Energy Act was amended in 1954, those authorities now reside at both DOE and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Our nation's expertise in nuclear energy, from safely operating reactors to the application of technology to the strong regulatory regime, is the best in the world. However, our foreign competitors are making strategic investments to directly support their respective nuclear interests to gain an advantage in emerging markets. So we should recognize that foreign government support for expansion of their nuclear industries into new markets is driven by more than economic interests. There are profound national security and strategic implications for dominance in the civil nuclear space, and so we must appropriately consider the implications of losing our leadership position in developing markets and align our national policy accordingly. The thoughtful legislative proposals we will consider this morning target specific challenges facing America's nuclear scientists, innovators, suppliers, and reactor operators. So the bills will help deploy and advance nuclear technologies, enhance our nuclear supplier industry's ability to effectively compete in global markets, and establish transparency and predictability in our regulatory framework. Each of these bills can help reinvigorate different components of our nuclear ecosystem, and in doing so, the legislation will facilitate innovation and competition, which provides the dual benefits of both being good for consumers while protecting our national security interests. So I really want to thank members on both sides of the aisle who worked on these bills, including Representatives Kinzinger and Doyle, Hudson, Peters, Flores, and McNerney, and Johnson. Your leadership has really made a difference, and we're going to move these common sense bipartisan policies forward. It is appreciated. Thank you for your work, and I look forward to supporting this effort. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, the subcommittee will mark up our 4 nuclear energy bills. At the legislative hearing in May, I expressed concern with two of the proposals before us. First, the Advancing U.S. Civil Nuclear Competitiveness and Jobs Act makes changes to the Part 810 process, by which the Secretary of Energy authorizes the transfer of nuclear energy technology and assistance to foreign countries. The bill establishes a brief 30-day time frame for the Secretary to approve the transfer of certain nuclear technologies to countries that are not nuclear weapon states, and I'm uncomfortable with expediting the review process for Part 810 at a time when there's so much global uncertainty with regard to nuclear proliferation. H.R. 1320, introduced by Representatives Kinzinger and Doyle, makes several major changes to the NRC budgeting process and fee structure, and I have concerns with the provision of the bill that sets up an expedited timeline for NRC review of nuclear reactors, because inflexible deadlines could jeopardize the environmental and safety review process for more complex applications. And I'm also concerned with the provision requiring NRC to issue a construction permit for a nuclear facility, even if an entity has filed a formal request for a hearing objecting to the project. And I think stakeholders should have a chance to voice their concerns publicly before a project permit is issued. But despite those concerns, I appreciate our colleagues' efforts to address the financial strain currently facing the nuclear industry, and I want to continue to work with them on this bill. But if I could just say, I want to reiterate in the time I have left what Ranking Member Bobby Rush said about the children's separation. I would strongly request that this committee hold a hearing immediately on the President's family separation policy that has led to more than 2,300 children being separated from their parents. I hope yesterday's executive order puts an end to the barbaric separation of families, but I am concerned that these families will continue to face inhumane treatment at the hands of the Trump administration. All of us on this committee should demand that the administration must now immediately reunite each of the more than 2,300 children who have already been separated from their parents. I actually saw some of them this Sunday on Father's Day. And I think the department, HHS, has been sending conflicting signals as to whether it will reunite these families. I know that every Democrat on this committee made a request to Chairman Walden and Burgess for a hearing as soon as possible. So I was just going to ask if I could, Mr. Chairman. Well, I guess he left, huh? All right, well. All right, let me just say that we're hoping, and I'm going to follow up with both Chairman Walden and Chairman Burgess to see if we can have a hearing as soon as possible, because I think this policy has created real trauma for thousands of kids, and we have to get answers from the Department of Health and Human Services. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I would note for all members that their opening statements can be made part of the record as a UC. Are there other members wishing to give an opening statement? Seeing none on the Republican side, on the Democratic side? Gentleman from California is recognized for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just briefly, I appreciate having my bill, H.R. 6141, on the agenda for the markup today, following a successful legislative hearing in May, and I thank Mr. Hudson for his work on the bill. As I've said before, nuclear energy technologies are an important part of increasing zero-emission energy sources. We need this energy generation and the clean air standards it can help us achieve. We also need to ensure those energy solutions are being best utilized by our armed forces. Just this week, in fact, I spoke to the Association of Defense Community about the future of energy use in the military, and this importance cannot be stressed enough. This bill would direct the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy to work together in analyzing how microreactors can bolster energy resiliency for national security. Doing so is an important step in developing the energy resources our armed forces need. In my home district in San Diego, the DoD has been a willing and helpful partner in developing and testing innovative energy resources, and I think the partnership in this bill makes sense, and I appreciate my colleagues' supportive vote on it today, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize Mr. Johnson for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this important markup today relating to nuclear energy. I'd like to briefly highlight one of the four important bills, a discussion draft titled the Advancing U.S. Nuclear Competitiveness and Jobs Act. The Department of Energy plays a critical role in America's civil and nuclear industry's engagement in international commerce through the Part 810 permitting process. With almost 200 gigawatts of new nuclear energy capacity projected to be added throughout the world by 2050, it's incumbent on Congress to ensure the Part 810 process is efficient and that it continues to maintain our strong nuclear non-proliferation posture. The U.S. nuclear industry faces intense foreign competition within the international civil nuclear market, many from enterprises with state backing like Russia and China. Those countries see getting a toehold in nuclear energy as a strategic tool to leverage themselves into a 100-year state-to-state relationship with other countries. The discussion draft before us today ensures DOE's 810 process remains robust, safe, and predictable. It takes common sense steps towards ensuring U.S. leadership in civil nuclear commerce continues to be competitive abroad without sacrificing national security concerns. I'm hopeful that we can put politics aside today, focus on the policies of this draft, and pass it with bipartisan support. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Other members wishing to give an opening statement? Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we're marking up 4 different nuclear energy bills that will address many of the challenges faced by the nuclear sector. It's important that we clear the way for the new technology and limit burdensome regulatory structures where possible. I'm a proud co-sponsor of H.R. 1320, the Nuclear Utilization Keynote Energy Act, introduced by Mr. Doyle and Mr. Kittenser. The bill makes several drastically necessary changes to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's budget and fee structure, as well as the license applications process. As we lose more and more zero-emission clean energy sources with the closure of nuclear plants across the country, the NRC fee structure places an undue financial burden on the plants which remain in operation. It's important that we address this issue now and give existing nuclear plants a fee framework that reflects the 21st century. I'm proud to support this bill and commend the excellent work of both my colleagues, Mr. Doyle and Mr. Kittinger. I also support H.R. 6140, the Advanced Nuclear Fuel Availability Act, introduced by Mr. Flores and Mr. McNerney. The bill directs the Secretary of Energy to establish a program for support of high-assay, low-enriched uranium that is required by newer advanced reactors. While supply of this fuel is still an issue, this bill takes many needed steps that will direct the Secretary to study questions that put us on the path to a modern nuclear fleet in the 2030s. Microreactors are another technology that I'm excited to see this committee look into. I support H.R. 6141 by Representative Wilson, Norcross, Hudson, and Peters to direct the DOE Secretary to develop a report for a pilot program for microreactors at critical national security sites. This technology has the potential to strengthen in some of our most important sites for nuclear security. Sustainable, clean, on-site power at these sites ensures that our nation's security will be protected in the event of an attack, allowing these important sites to function as they were meant to be without interruption. While I support many of the goals of Mr. Johnson's advancing U.S. Civil Nuclear Competitiveness and Jobs Act, there are still some outstanding issues with the bill as it currently stands that prevents me from supporting it today. The U.S. nuclear technology is best and safest in the world. There's a reason we see so many foreign companies wishing to develop their infrastructure with our expertise. While I feel the Section 810 does need work in
Gentleman's time is expiring.
Okay, I think 30 days is too short, Mr. Chairman, and hopefully before we go to markup in the full committee, that can be changed, and I appreciate your patience. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Other members wishing to give an opening statement? Seeing none, the chair will call up the discussion draft entitled Advancing U.S. Civil Nuclear Competitiveness and Jobs Act and ask the clerk to report.
Discussion draft to amend the Atomic Energy Act of 1954 to improve the process by which the Secretary of Energy authorizes the transfer of civilian nuclear commerce technology and assistance and for other purposes.
And without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point, so ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any other amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the gentleman from Oregon wish
A comment on the bill, Mr. Chairman?
strike the last word. Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, I'd just like to thank my friend from Ohio for introducing this bill and modernize the 810 process. I'm an all-above member when it comes to energy policy, and if we want to pursue an aggressive strategy to curb the effects of carbon, it's going to have to include not only renewable energy, but I believe nuclear as well. Also want U.S. companies to be competitive, not only here at home, but internationally too. With that said, I'm not quite sure we're here yet with this bill. I'm not comfortable with the idea we're going to be mandating the Secretary review these applications or delegate his authority or make a determination within just 30 days, especially when we're talking about sending sensitive nuclear technology to non-nuclear nations. That is completely unrealistic and I believe unsafe. In addition, I think it'd be more prudent if we had DOE also report back to Congress about the A-10 process and making it more effective before we pass legislation expediting the program. As a result, I'll be voting no today, but I'd like to continue to work with Mr. Johnson and members of the committee to improve the bill before a full committee. I thank the chairman and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize to strike the last word, Mr. Johnson.
Move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman. When Congress amended the Atomic Energy Act in 1954 to provide for the commercial use of nuclear technology, the United States was one of only a few countries who had nuclear energy capacity. Today, countries throughout the world have access to nuclear technology, and the United States is no longer the only game in town. Today, our domestic nuclear suppliers face very stiff global competition, mainly from nuclear state-owned vendors who use nuclear energy projects to implement national policy objectives and as a job creator back home. These state-owned entities will offer nuclear project debt with better terms than market rates and even use these projects as part of a larger deal and not simply a standalone commercial deal. As the graph shows that you'll see here, over 50% of new nuclear builds are currently going to China and Russia. That's concerning to me, and it should be concerning to every member of this committee, especially considering nuclear power plants last a very long time. I don't know about everyone else in the room, but I prefer countries engaging with the United States rather than Russia to meet their peaceful nuclear energy needs. So, this discussion is about giving DOE and its staff the tools they need to safely and efficiently consider these specific authorizations, thereby helping our domestic nuclear suppliers to more effectively compete within this intensely competitive world market. Importantly, DOE has recognized the need for a timely review process for these authorizations and has made progress over the last several years to improve the efficiency and transparency of the Part 810 process. This has been under both Democratic and Republican administrations. In fact, in February 2015, DOE published published efficiency revisions to the 810 regulations, the first such revision since 1986. Those revisions were based on recommendations that stemmed from a Government Accountability Office report requested by Chairman Upton. This discussion draft builds upon that work through sensible statutory reforms, many of which DOE is unable to accomplish through further rulemakings. Specifically, it directs the Secretary of Energy to establish procedures for predictable and timely consideration of exports of certain low-risk technologies. It permits the Secretary to delegate the approval of certain low-risk authorizations to reduce the paperwork and the workload for the Secretary, and it requires the Department of Energy to process authorizations concurrently during the interagency review. This draft ensures important safeguards are in place and upheld, such as maintaining the current interagency review process, and still requires the State Department to receive assurances from a foreign government regarding the use and transfer of nuclear technology. I urge my colleagues to support this important draft, and if my colleagues object to any of the policy provisions contained within the draft, I stand ready and willing to work on those provisions. As the ranking member acknowledged during the legislative hearing on this draft, the 810 process must function well for the U.S. to remain competitive within the civil nuclear marketplace. This draft is a step towards achieving that goal and is crucial that we separate these common sense policy reforms from politics. I'd also like to point out that there is bipartisan language contained within the Senate FY 2019 NDAA aimed at improving the 810 process. So I would hope we'd find some common ground on the House side as well. There's clearly a need for this language. And with that, I urge my colleagues to support the draft. And now I'd like to yield some time to my colleague from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle, to speak on behalf of this bill.
and I want to thank you for your work to address the 810 process. I've heard from several companies in my district who have faced challenges navigating the process to export nuclear technology. The demand for nuclear technology is growing in international markets, and this presents a great opportunity for jobs not only in Pittsburgh, but across the United States. When we are exporting nuclear technology to other countries, we must protect our national security and our non-proliferation goals. But there are also some common sense changes that can be made to this process for low-risk technology. This legislation takes important steps to do so. You know, if we're not able to export our technology, other countries will step in to fill the void, and American jobs will suffer. It is far better to have American technologies and companies on the ground in other countries than to have countries such as Russia building nuclear plants throughout the world. I appreciate my colleagues' effort to address this important issue and believe that we can streamline the process without sacrificing national security or our non-proliferation goals. And I share the gentleman's comment that if we have members that want to see some changes or have some concerns to this bill, let's work together and get this bill out of the committee. I thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, the bottom line is this. If we're going to be competitive, we got to be responsive. If we're not responsive, other nations like Russia and China are going to be, and we're going to lose our lead, our edge in nuclear non-proliferation. So with that, I urge a yes vote on this legislation, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time expired. Chair to recognize Ranking Member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I stated at the legislative hearing on this bill, I appreciate that the Part 810 process must function well for the U.S. to remain competitive in the commercial nuclear space, but the bill establishes this brief 30-day frame for the Secretary to approve the transfer of certain low proliferation risk nuclear technologies to countries that are not nuclear weapon states. Further, President Trump has abandoned the Iran deal, and now Saudi Arabia has said that if Iran restarts its nuclear program, Saudi Arabia will itself pursue building nuclear weapons. So I am uncomfortable with expediting the review process for Part 810 at a time when there's so much global uncertainty with regard to nuclear proliferation. 30 days, I think, is just too short of a time frame in the current climate to properly address security questions regarding the use of these nuclear technologies. I also believe that DOE can improve this process on its own without congressional involvement. DOE testified at the legislative hearing on this bill that it has made numerous improvements to the process through its Part 10 process improvement plan. Further, DOE testified, and I quote, that the lengthiest part of the authorization process remains the time it takes partner countries to provide the required governmental nonproliferation assurances, which can result in processing delays of 6 months to well over a year, unquote. So it seems as if the goal of this bill is to be more competitive by being less secure, and that's troubling. I'm not saying that's what you want, but that's my concern. And I understand the desire for a predictable Part 810 review process. This is just not the right time, in my opinion, to possibly cut corners on oversight of these technologies and the potential for nuclear proliferation. Now, I know that Mr. Johnson put up that chart. I don't know where it went. I don't know if we have to put it up again, but Mr. Johnson argued that China and Russia are dominating the global nuclear industry and exporting their technologies to more countries. But of course, China and Russia do not have the stringent export and licensing policies like the U.S. And once again, it seems if the goal of the bill is to be more competitive, I'm concerned that we not be more competitive by being less secure. That's what troubles me here. So I do ask that my colleagues vote no on the legislation. I yield back, Mr. Chairman, unless someone wants my time. I don't think so. Thank you.
Other members wishing to speak on the bill? Seeing none, no amendments being offered. The question now occurs on forwarding the discussion draft to the full committee. All those in favor will ask for a roll call. Roll call has been requested. The clerk will call the roll. This will be on passage of the discussion draft.
Mr. Olson.
Aye.
Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. Barton. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes aye. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes aye. Mr. Flores. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Duncan votes aye. Chairman Walden. Mr. Rush.
No.
Mr. Rush votes no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack votes no. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes no. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy votes no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Chairman Upton. Chairman Upton votes aye.
Vote Mr. Barton. Vote aye.
Mr. Barton votes aye.
Members wishing to cast a vote or change their vote? Seeing none. Wait, how's Mr. Walden?
Chairman Walden votes aye.
Anybody else? Clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 19 ayes and 12 noes.
19 ayes. Oh, how's Mr. Butterfield recorded?
Mr. Butterfield is
Oh, man, maybe, all right. Mr. Butterfield is recorded as no.
Butterfield votes no.
It's not 2 in the morning, nor is it going to get there. So on that, the clerk will report 19 ayes, 13 noes. Oh, and Mr. Flores.
Mr. Flores votes aye.
20. I'll let the clerk report now, just to make sure.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 20 ayes and 13 noes.
20 ayes, 13 noes. The bill is favorably reported. The draft is favorably reported. The chair will now call up H.R. 1320 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 1320, to amend the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1990 related to Nuclear Regulatory Commission user fees and annual charges and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point so ordered. And Mr. Kinzinger and Doyle are seeking recognition to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
So, clerk report.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1320, offered by Mr. Kinzinger.
Without objection, the first reading considered as read, and the gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to see this being included today, the Nuke Act, which my colleague Mike Doyle and I have been working on for well over a year, including today, and I thank him for his help. We've worked on this bill for so long because we both realize that this is a pivotal moment for nuclear power. This is technology that was invented in my home state of Illinois, so, that makes us better than everybody else on that, and continues to provide my constituents with reliable, carbon-free electricity. Unfortunately, the fate of our nation's nuclear fleet is not guaranteed, and the consequences of continued early retirement, from the loss of good jobs to ceding our global leadership on safety and nonproliferation, are all too real. And as was discussed on the prior bill, there are a lot of issues we have to deal with in terms of continuing our world leadership in a very different world than when the rules were written. This legislation provides reasonable reforms to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to increase accountability, transparency, and predictability in regulation. Reducing the regulatory burden on existing plants while still maintaining the NRC's gold standard of safety will make it easier for not only our current fleet of nuclear plants, but also the next generation of nuclear to thrive. This amendment makes several changes to H.R. 1320, many of which are based on technical feedback from the NRC and based on feedback from my colleagues on this committee. Specifically, this amendment extends several compliance and reporting dates to account for the passage of time since the bill was introduced in March of 2017. Further, Section 8 is replaced with a sense of Congress to reflect the NRC's progress towards a rule on plant decommissioning. With many licenses and local communities awaiting guidance from NRC on this process, the previous language would have further delayed this by requiring NRC to restart the rulemaking process. Additionally, based on concerns from Ranking Member Pallone during last month's hearing, the deadlines in Section 7 have been modified to provide additional flexibility and recognition that unforeseen circumstances may arise to prevent those deadlines from being met. I look forward to continuing to work with members on both sides of the aisle to further refine this bill. Overall, this amendment, in the nature of a substitute, provides improved clarity and additional flexibility in this great underlying bill. With that, I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment, and if Mr. Doyle wants my timer to claim his own, I'm happy to yield to him.
I thank the gentleman, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak about the Nuke Act that I co-sponsor with my colleague and friend Adam Kinzinger. Nuclear energy provides nearly 40% of Pennsylvania's electricity and employs thousands of skilled workers in Pennsylvania. And despite being a carbon-free and reliable source of baseload power, the nuclear energy industry is facing pressure from a variety of factors, such as increasing NRC fees and uncertainty in the export process. Addressing some of these issues will be necessary not only to protect jobs in Pennsylvania and across the country, but as well to meet our nation's climate goals. I want to thank my colleague Adam Kinzinger for his leadership and work on the Nuke Act. This bipartisan legislation will take important steps to modernize the NRC's fee structure, set achievable and flexible timelines for application reviews, and look to future reforms that will ensure the NRC can continue to effectively protect public health and safety. The bill addresses a serious reality facing the nuclear industry. As nuclear power plants retire, the remaining fleet will be faced with increasing fees from NRC. We need to support our existing nuclear plants while ensuring that the NRC is able to fulfill its mission. I believe this legislation accomplishes those goals, and I would remind all of my colleagues that if we start to lose our nuclear portfolio in this country, it will be impossible to meet our climate change goals. So those of us that believe climate change is real and want to see that problem addressed, we dare not continue to lose nuclear facilities, especially before their time. And that's why I think this legislation is necessary, and I support it, and I thank Mr. Kinzinger. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak? Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the efforts of my colleagues to address issues relating to the licensing of nuclear power reactors here in the U.S. H.R. 1320 makes a number of changes to the NRC budget process and fee structure, and I do worry that several of the provisions could arbitrarily limit the resources the NRC needs and adversely affect its ability to do its job. I appreciate that several changes made in the amendment in the nature of a substitute give NRC more flexibility, but I still have concerns about limiting NRC's resources. The bill also sets time limits for NRC to complete major milestones in the licensing process. NRC is given 24 months to complete a draft environmental impact statement and 42 months to complete the technical review process. While this timeline may be realistic for most projects, it doesn't give the Commission the necessary flexibility, in my opinion, to take the time it may need to study relevant issues if it receives a more complex application. As I said in my opening statement, I'm also concerned with a provision requiring NRC to issue a construction permit for a nuclear facility, even if an entity has filed a formal request for a hearing objecting to the project. The stakeholders have testified that it's already extremely difficult to intervene in the licensing process for a nuclear facility, especially if you're not an expert. So I don't think we should be limiting the opportunity for stakeholders to have their views heard in the licensing process. I'm not able to support the bill if this provision remains when the bill is considered at the full committee. But my concerns aside, I do support making common sense changes to the NRC licensing process that can ease the pressure on the nuclear industry without jeopardizing safety or the environment. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak? Gentleman from Vermont.
I move to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank Mr. Kinzinger and Mr. Doyle for their work on this. I'd like to speak briefly on a measure contained in the bill dealing with the nuclear plant decommissioning process. Vermont has a decommissioned nuclear plant. More and more are going offline. There will be the issues that Mr. Doyle mentioned that we have to contend with. But one of the things we have to focus on is the impact on the communities and the rulemaking process at the NRC. The provision in the bill that I'm speaking about, Section 8 of AINS, contains a sense of Congress provision stating that a safe, effective, and efficient decommissioning process for nuclear reactors that supports the principles of good regulation, including openness, clarity, and reliability, is vital to all licensees and local communities, and that the NRC should complete the final rulemaking in the next 18 months. I'm very happy that that provision was included by Mr. Kinzinger and Mr. Doyle. The impact of the decommissioning on local communities is very significant. As you know, the NRC is currently developing a draft regulatory guidance to determine how a nuclear plant decommissioning should unfold. We have regulation in places guiding the development of new nuclear reactors, but Vermont's experience with Vermont Yankee has shown that we lack a coherent structure on how reactors should be taken down after their useful life. And to that end, this is an important rulemaking that I was pleased to see the NRC update. Yet I'm concerned by the direction the NRC is heading. While the Commission appears to be inclined to use rulemaking to sign off on the nuclear industry's wish list of cost-saving measures, such as streamlined safety exemptions, it fails to address the concerns of state and local communities across the country that are hosting nuclear reactors and want a seat at the table. There are several specific concerns that I have with the current approach at the NRC, and other members who have plants that are going to go offline might share these. Lack of state and local stakeholder involvement, questionable use of the decommissioning trust fund, such as for spent fuel management, the reality that the use of safe store decommissioning procedures will effectively delay a full cleanup and redevelopment of nuclear sites for decades, the reduction of emergency planning functions during periods when spent fuel remains in spent fuel pools. It's apparent that the industry would like to narrow the scope of this rulemaking to only what they deem the most pressing matters. I believe we must push back on that. We're at a critical point that will shape how communities deal with decommissioning for decades. It's imperative that the NRC take a comprehensive approach to this that guarantees host communities a seat at the table. I want to work with Mr. Kinzinger and Mr. Doyle to see if we can build on Section 8 in their bill of this legislation to encourage NRC to address these issues as part of the rulemaking, and I hope Mr. Doyle and Mr. Kinzinger, we can work together on that going forward. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs. Are there further amendments? Seeing none, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 1320 as amended to the full committee. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. Chair now calls up H.R. 6140 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 6140, to require the Secretary of Energy to establish and carry out a program to support the availability of high-assay, low-enriched uranium for domestic commercial use and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any amendments to the bill?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Most of today's nuclear reactors are very similar in nature, and they operate on a fuel that is generally enriched below 5%. The next generation of advanced reactors is currently under development. However, they vary in size and operation, and they will need greater flexibility and efficiencies from an advanced fuel. This fuel is known as high-assay low-enriched uranium, or HALEU for short, and it's enriched at higher levels than what is currently available in the commercial market. The Bipartisan Advanced Nuclear Fuel Availability Act, which I introduced with my friend Mr. McNerney, establishes a public-private partnership through the Energy Department's Office of Nuclear Energy to support the availability of high-assay, lower-rich uranium for domestic commercial use. This bill, as introduced, also includes updates to the discussion draft from last month's legislative hearing, including first, a clarification that members of the consortium may include entities involved in any state of the nuclear fuel cycle. Second, that the applicability of secretarial determinations on uranium transfers will be set. And third, it incorporates other technical feedback. A March 2017 survey of 18 U.S.-based advanced nuclear developers found that a lack of availability of advanced fuel is the foremost factor that would impede the development and deployment of advanced nuclear technologies. Simply put, this bill would ensure that there is a robust supply of advanced fuel available for the domestic commercial industry to purchase for the advanced nuclear reactors of tomorrow. I want to again thank my friend Mr. McNerney for working with me on this bill, and I look forward to seeing H.R. 6140 advance to the full committee for consideration. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wish? Gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney. Strike the last word.
Strike the last word. I thank the chairman and ranking member for bringing this legislation to the committee, and I'm glad to work with Mr. Flores to advance nuclear technology. We need a diverse energy mix, and nuclear energy provides a zero carbon emission electricity. The availability of high-assay, low-enriched uranium is critical to these efforts. Federal investments and protocols regarding the transportation, fuel fabrication, and enrichment to effectively bring this fuel to the market are encouraging. Small modular reactors, or SMRs, will be useful in a variety of settings, and this type of fuel needs to be available by the time SMRs are more widely available. The consortium that is formed here is a type of partnership that will be useful in kickstarting this industry and then turning it over to let industry take the reins. However, I do have some proliferation concerns that still need to be addressed. I'm glad to see the authorizing language included here that was not included in the previous discussion draft. I look forward to working with my colleague, Mr. Flores, and moving this legislation along through the committee and onto the floor to help us meet our nation's complex energy and environmental needs. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak? Seeing none, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 6140 to the full committee. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is forwarded to the full committee. Chair calls up now H.R. 6141 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 6141, to require the Secretary of Energy to develop a report on the pilot program to site, construct, and operate microreactors at critical national security locations and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 6141 to the full committee. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Yeah, I know. Right here. I put them at the bottom. So I would like to recognize one of our councils on the Energy Subcommittee staff, Jason Stanek. After spending 15 years at FERC, Jason joined the staff last year. He's done tremendous work on electricity issues, particularly with our Powering American series. He's leaving us tomorrow. He's been appointed as the chairman of the Maryland Public Utility Commission. So Mr. Sarbanes, he's a guy that you well know. So it is well deserved. We know that he's got a wonderful background. We look forward to working with him in the days and months ahead. Best of luck, man. You're great. Thank you. And without objection, the staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the legislation approved by the subcommittee today. So ordered, and without objection, the subcommittee stand adjourned.